In Chapter 9, we are introduced to Lewis's guide throughout the rest of the Great Divorce, a man named George MacDonald. And the chapter is long enough that I've devoted the next 3 segments to talking about this chapter. It's central in many ways to the whole book. First, I think we should just talk a little bit about George MacDonald, who he is and what kind of influence he exerted on Lewis such that he would occupy this central place in this book. George MacDonald was born in 1824 and died in 1905. He was Scottish. He started as a clergyman and later became a novelist, author of many children's stories. Probably the one that you would still find in the bookstores, The Princess and the Goblin, which G.K. Chesterton, in fact, was a big fan of. He had a very short-lived career as a preacher. Most of his time he spent teaching English literature, writing, giving lecture tours. He lived in poverty most of his life and also suffered from poor health. In the 1870s, he got an invitation to tour and lecture in the United States, and very well received by huge audiences, by writers like Waldo Emerson, by G.K. Chesterton, Longfellow, Walt Whitman. He formed a friendship with Mark Twain and exerted some degree of influence on him. George MacDonald inspired a number of authors, William W.H. Auden, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Evelyn Nisbet, and Madeleine L'Engle. Before there was Lord of the Rings or before there was Chronicles of Narnia, the great series of fantasy books out there was really George MacDonald. Lewis wrote in a preface to an anthology of George MacDonald that he put together himself that he felt a great debt of justice to MacDonald, that he regarded him always as a master, and he never concealed that he's never written a book. Lewis said he'd never written a book where he didn't quote from him. It seemed to him that a lot of people that appreciated his books, that is Lewis's books, never really had an appreciation for MacDonald. And so in putting together that anthology, he was trying to lead people to see all these wonderful insights that he had gotten out of MacDonald from years of writing. George MacDonald exerted 2 basic influences on Lewis. The first was imaginative and the second was theological. Let's look at that first one. When Lewis was 16 years old, he discovered MacDonald's book Phantastes. This is an imaginative adventure story where a young man on his 21st birthday is catapulted into this fairy world and has this long adventure. Strange allegorical things happen, symbolic things happen, as well as a kind of a literal progress through danger and eventually return to his own world. Lewis talks about this story converting and baptizing his imagination. By the time he was 16, he was no longer a believer. He had given up the Christian faith. And yet, Phantastes, MacDonald's work, had the effect of, if you like, Christianizing his imagination, even though his intellect wasn't coming along for the ride. He talks about the influence of this book as somehow opening up the real world around him. As he puts it in his autobiographical work, Surprised by Joy, I saw the bright shadow coming out of the book into the real world and resting there, transforming all the common things and yet itself unchanged. Or, more accurately, I saw the common things drawn into the bright shadow. In other words, this was a book that allowed him to have now a kind of enchanted view of the real world, that somehow there was something wonderful and magical about the real universe in which he lived. If somebody had told him when he was older that this thing that he discovered was goodness, that would have surprised him. But now he realized that, you know, all the moralism, the things that I had been taught about right and wrong, all these things that I had been taught in a way which confined right and wrong to being law and duty, somehow in MacDonald, they were made wonderful, magical. The way he puts it is, it lets us feel on our face the sweet air blowing from the land of righteousness. In other words, there was something about MacDonald's work that allowed him to see the beauty of the faith, the beauty, in fact, of living for God and living for godly things. Although, in encountering that as a 16-year-old, he didn't quite realize that that was what was happening. Lewis commends what he calls the mythopoeic ability that MacDonald had. In other words, that he could create something that was imaginatively compelling. His writing was something that at times was not even second rate. Lewis did not respect MacDonald as a writer, but the ideas, the sort of imaginative world into which he would put you, he could do that better than anybody else. Maybe when we think about myths, we think about something that comes from ancient history, from the Greeks or from the Romans. And yet, MacDonald had this imaginative power that he could craft a kind of other world and otherworldly things and make those ideas so compelling that they stuck with you, even when the prose and the delivery wasn't so great. He said of MacDonald that when it came to making a myth, this was the greatest genius of this kind that I know. Of course, we now are used to this sort of thing from Lewis, from J.R.R. Tolkien and Narnia, but the very inspiration for that sort of creativity came from George MacDonald. Okay, second influence. If you look at this anthology that Lewis put together, most of the works that he drew from are what are called the unspoken sermons. These are sermons, by and large, that were written by George MacDonald, but they were never delivered. They were never given as sermons in church. And Lewis says quite openly, "My debt to this book is nearly as great as one man can owe to another." He considered that this was a book that was indispensable in terms of helping people accept the Christian faith. That these 3 volumes of these unspoken sermons, as he puts it, have this closeness to the Spirit of Christ himself. They have this wonderful Christ-like union of tenderness and severity. And he says, nowhere else outside the New Testament have I found terror and comfort so intertwined. In other words, these 2 essential aspects of what he understands Christ's teaching to be, that there is this fearfulness that we should have in light of sin and God's law, but also this wonderful comfort that comes from Christ's atonement, from God's love and mercy. These are perfectly entwined, perfectly put together in MacDonald's writing. So it is fitting that here, as we come to the middle of the Great Divorce, that MacDonald ends up being his theological guide and teacher. Just as in Dante, Dante is first led through the Inferno and the Purgatorio by Virgil, and then by Beatrice in the Paradiso, that Lewis himself has a guide who explains to him what's happening, what he's seeing, and what its significance is. That's, of course, what Virgil and Beatrice do within the Divine Comedy, and now MacDonald occupies that same role here. Well, in the next section, we'll look at MacDonald's opening discussion of what Lewis is seeing and what it means.